If I wanted to borrow your car, if I wanted a bite of, your lunch, I would ask you for that. I wouldn't just come in and do it. I wouldn't come and just take your car keys and take your car. That's theft, right? I mean, in everything we do, there's some form of consent being given when we're interacting with other people. So consent is the voluntary agreement to engage in any sort of intimate activity. It's interesting because we talk about consent in the context of intimacy, but consent is honestly a part of literally everything we do in our life. It's easy to see how in those other situations, like, yes, of course you would get consent if you wanted to borrow someone's car, otherwise you're stealing it. Why do we look at it differently with intimacy? Consent needs to always be there. Whenever anyone is engaging in any sort of intimate activity, consent should always be there, whether you're in a dating relationship and that consent is relative to kissing or holding hands, or you're in a marital relationship and the consent is relative to marital intimacy. Consent always has to be there.
I guess in a sense there's more than just verbal consent, there's physical consent without having to necessarily use your words and say, yes, you can kiss me, or yes, like let's date. It can be sort of like your physical body language, the way you're saying things with how you're acting and the way you look at another person. That can also be a sign of consent, I think. You can make it a more physical appearance than just verbal.
When it comes to nonverbal body language consent, in an established relationship, it's easier to understand that because you know the person much better. Not to say that that's always the case. I think there are still times in marriage and in long-standing relationships where you need to get that verbal consent because you might just not be sure. But I think in a relationship where you're just starting to get to know someone, verbal consent is always the way to go because then it's clear, yes, I have consent, or no, I don't. And the best way to get someone's consent is to ask them. Whether you are giving or receiving consent, there should be some communication there. Consent is all about communication. They go hand in hand, and it's important that they're both there.
Consent is extremely important. However, just as important as consent is, so is communication and confidence as well. So I think it's important to communicate your feelings and what you want, but also important to know what you want and have a knowledge of that before you get yourself in a situation where you have to make that choice.
We're taught women are supposed to be nice and women are supposed to be kind and, and more passive and quiet. And I think that if we could really help women understand to use their voice and to be able to express their agency, the agency that God has given them to do or not do something, that would be great.